Hi, welcome to my video on Reconstruction in the New South. This video will go along with Chapter 15 in your textbook. I still highly advise that you read the textbook because even though I'll go over Reconstruction in the New South, you'll get more details out of the textbook. So I highly advise you still read the textbook. For what it's worth, just going through the Reconstruction era, it's going to encompass the years 1865 to 1877. It's bringing the South back into the Union. Over that 12-year period, you're going to have three presidents. Andrew Johnson, who's going to take over for Abraham Lincoln after he's assassinated. Ulysses S. Grant, who's going to use his popularity during the Civil War to become president of the United States for 8 scandalous years. And then Rutherford B. Hayes will end the Reconstruction era for when he was elected. It was part of a compromise, which will formally end Reconstruction. Some things to think about while we're going through this video is evaluate the extent that Civil War impacted the political, social, and economic landscape of the United States, because there's going to be a whole lot of changes that are going to occur. To what extent did Reconstruction maintain continuity and foster change in American politics and society? You're going to have three amendments added to the Constitution: the 14th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But there's still a lot of racism, discrimination, and economic poverty that's still going to be continuous throughout the era. Um, if we were going to ask, think about questions leading up into Reconstruction, is how do we rebuild the South after its destruction during the Civil War? We destroy its infrastructure, we destroy their economy. How do we rebuild the South after the Civil War? You have 4 million slaves that were freed as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, now we got to find them jobs, and we've got to provide support for them as well. So how do we deal with newly freed slaves in the South? How does the South? How would the South be reintegrated into the Union? What kind of plan do we have in place? Abraham Lincoln has an idea how to do it. Andrew Johnson will have an idea of how to do it, and the radical Republicans will have um, their own opinion as well. So everybody has a different opinion on how to bring the South back into the Union, and should they even be punished, and who would control it? Would the Southern states control their own way back into the Union? Would it be from the president's point of view or from Congress? And then finally, how would American citizenship be defined? And that's going to encompass with the 14th Amendment. So if you don't know what actually Reconstruction is, it's the restoration of the seceded states into the Union. The major questions that faced the government at the time, and we've kind of already talked about them, is what was the relationship of the relation of the seceded states to the Union? How should Southern whites be treated, and what should be done for free African Americans? So when we're talking about problems resulting from the Civil War, really they're broken down into economic, political, and social reasons. So from an economic standpoint, if we're just talking about what are some problems that existed as a result of the Civil War, economically, plantations were in ruin. They had lost all their labor force, factories, bridges, railroads, southern facilities were all destroyed, mainly because of William Sherman. 4 million Negroes were newly freed. They didn't have any jobs. They didn't have homes to live in. They were once a slave to the white man, and now they're a slave to cold, hunger, and disease. And also, the South had $3 billion with a B, $3 billion in debt that needed to be resolved. From a political standpoint, now we're talking about political problems. Southern states had to be brought into the Union, and civilian governments had to be reestablished. How do we do that? What does that look like? And then finally, social problems. There was a new set of relationship that had to be worked out between whites and blacks in America, and the status of newly freed blacks had to be clarified. And so when you look at Reconstruction, they really wanted to look at the relationship between political democracy and economic democracy. And you're going to see newly freed African Americans make a lot of political advancements through the 14th, 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. However, there is still, the freedom to buy, sell, and trade, and to achieve and go get whatever job you want. That's still going to be limited for African Americans. And so, from a political standpoint, it was an attempt to reconstruct democracy in America. Whereas before in the U.S. Constitution, equality was never mentioned in the Constitution, mainly because the founding fathers did not agree that equality should exist between whites and blacks. And so when when we're passing these amendments and African Americans are getting the right to vote and they're getting the ability to hold public office, you're really reconstructing democracy in America. So when we think of Reconstruction, I know we think about rebuilding the South and building new buildings, but we also got to think about the political effects of it all. If we were going to look at kind of the relationship between whites and blacks throughout our history, when John Rolfe brought slaves to America in 1619, all the way to 1865, slavery was the peculiar institution that was instituted in the United States. Between 1865 and 1877 was the Reconstruction period, and then from 1877 to 1890, kind of that Gilded Age time period, there's an adjustment period where they're trying to finding their niche in the world, and a lot of them will suffer from poverty because of the lack of jobs. Between 1890 and 1954 is the segregation era, mainly because of the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which makes segregation legal in the U.S. Once Brown versus the Board of Education is passed in 1954, we now enter the Civil Rights era from 1954, and some claim that the Civil Rights era is still going on today. All right. So as we're looking at kind of an overview of kind of the plans that were put in place between 1864, really 1863 to 1865, Lincoln's 10% plan. But we know that Lincoln was assassinated, and so he's not going to see his vision carried out. However, in 1865, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, is going to be passed, added to the Constitution. There is no more slavery in the United States. In 1865 to 1866 is your era of presidential Reconstruction, where Andrew Johnson's version of Lincoln's proposal is going to be enacted, only to be thwarted by the radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. And then from 1867 to 66 to 67 is the congressional plan, which is a lot like Lincoln's with the 14th Amendment to define citizenship. And we'll talk about that in this video. In 1867 to 1877 is military Reconstruction, which is what we use to bring the South back into the Union, which is basically the 14th Amendment plus black suffrage that was later established the 15th Amendment, and then we'll come to a formal end in 1877. So while the North and South suffered a lot of death because of the Civil War, the Southern industry was stopped as a result of destruction and inflation. Agriculture is going to slow down because they don't have a workforce. It's going to take them 10 years to recover to pre-war levels. The infrastructure completely destroyed. Confederate politicians and military leaders were jailed until 1868. The South had to rebuild. Either the South had to rebuild the North, or the North would have to provide for the South. And also, most Southerners did not acknowledge defeat. So now, how do we bring the Union back together, right? And so this is going to start with Lincoln's plan. And so to kind of briefly kind of go over Lincoln's proposal, his proposal is that he's going to offer a pardon to all supporters of the Confederacy if they swore allegiance to the Union and pledged to accept the end of slavery. When 10% of the men eligible to vote in 1860 did this, the state qualified for re-entry into the Union. This new state constitution had to outlaw slavery, but it did not provide protection for free African Americans. And so this was a very lenient plan. If you remember in his second inaugural address, he'll say, with malice towards all, with charity for all. And he always kind of looked at the Confederates as kind of states in rebellion. He never recognized them as ever leaving and becoming their own country, becoming the Confederacy. And so this was kind of a forgive and forget kind of mentality, which was a really good deal for the South. So very lenient. At Appomattox Courthouse, if you remember, Ulysses Grant told Grant, "Put down your weapons and go home." No, there was no treaty, no harsh punishment. And so if you look at this plan, it's a very lenient plan. And so who would be against this? Who would not want it? It would be somebody who would want to punish the South. And that group was called the Radical Republicans, led by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. They wanted to treat these areas as conquered provinces, and they wanted harsh treatment for the South. Because if you look at the ramifications of this, if this gets passed, and the 13th Amendment taking effect, that means rather than 3/5 of all slaves equal population, now it's one man, one count towards towards population, which means 12 more congressmen would have been allowed into the House of Representatives, which even means that the South would have a bigger, even have more representation in Congress. And so a lot of Republicans were against that. But what do we know? We know that Lincoln gets assassinated, and so his plan won't come completely into fruition. One of the things that was established before Lincoln was assassinated was the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865 by Oliver Howard, when its goal was to provide food, clothing, medical care, education. Um, and its biggest legacy is going to come from medical from education. There was the hope that they would get 40 acres in the mule, but it was never 40 acres was never given to free blacks. They wanted the goal was to aid refugees and freedmen by furnishing food, giving medical care, supervising labor contracts, managing abandoned and confiscated land, and arbitrating court disputes between the freedmen. Andrew Johnson, who will become president after the assassination, was completely against this. Two things you need to know about Andrew Johnson: really a Democrat, right? And then he was also a racist. So he's going to try to veto this. He was against the Bureau. He'll twice veto it, and Congress will override the veto to keep it functioning, but it will die out in 1870. But his biggest legacy will come from education. So, just something to think about when it comes to the Freedmen's Bureau. So Andrew Johnson, who was a war Democrat, will become president after the assassination. The reason why he was vice president was because Lincoln thought he was going to lose the election of 1864. And so when you think about it, you think it's preposterous that Lincoln would have he would have lost in 1864. But because that the North was not really winning the Civil War at the time, there was thoughts that he might lose. So he decides to make Andrew Johnson his vice president to kind of appeal to some moderate Republicans, and it works. And when he's assassinated, you really see the Democratic side of Andrew Johnson. So when you think of Andrew Johnson, you really need to think kind of works a little bit with Lincoln's plan. His proposal was his plan after Lincoln was assassinated. He ascended to the presidency. He wanted amnesty to whites who signed a loyalty oath. He said that states must abolish slavery, so that's a good thing. States must pay their war debts. There was no role for freed blacks. There was no vote for African Americans. And so he has several times is going to, well, he vetoes the Freedmen's Bureau. That gets overridden. He's going to veto the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That gets overridden as well, which leads to the 14th Amendment. So, Johnson's soft approach did not include oversight in the South, and this is going to lead to a series of racist laws known as the Black Codes, and we'll talk about that. Talk about resistance for the South later on. Under Johnson's Reconstruction plan, you can kind of take a look and see his philosophy mirrored the philosophy of Lincoln. However, he wanted to add rich white Southerners to the list of those who wouldn't be allowed to vote. He'll offer pardons to most Southerners who pledged allegiance to the Union, who agreed to abolish slavery, as long as the total value of their taxable property was under $20,000. He accepted the government of every Southern state that disowned its act of secession, repudiated the Confederate debt, and also ratified the 15th Amendment. All right, to which, of course, the radical Republicans are going to be against this. So there's their philosophies there. So if you need to pause just to kind of look it over one more time, biggest thing is to make sure you know that Lincoln's was lenient and that Johnson is really going to kind of be a Democrat in Republican clothing. So now you have the radical Republicans. In 1866, during the midterm elections, the Republicans are going to win the majorities of the Northern legislature. They'll pretty much run Congress, assuring the party enough votes to override any presidential veto. Um, in 1865, Johnson had claimed that Reconstruction was over. The radical Republicans who wanted harsher treatment disagreed, and they fought to deny the newly elected Southern members, most of whom were former Confederate officers. And what this is going to lead to is all that's going to happen is that these Confederate leaders are going to retake their governments in the Southern states. Um, the So going to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, um, it basically said it passed over Johnson's veto, and it gave the protection of citizenship to blacks. It guaranteed them equal treatment under law, and troops could be used to enforce these laws. And so the big thing is how to apply this law, equal protection under law. What does that mean? And so when the 14th Amendment is passed in June of 1866, they're going to it's passed by Congress, referred to the states for ratification. It defines citizenship. It's going to exclude former Confederate officials from holding office, and it's going to threaten to reduce a state's representation in the House if there was discrimination against black voters. 10 states will reject this, along with President Johnson. However, it will eventually get ratified into law. Um, so if you're a radical Republican, what do you want? You want equality for freedmen and prevent the re-enslavement of blacks, which was a good thing. They were angered because Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was too soft. They believed that the states needed to be recreated, and only Congress, them, can decide how the South is governed. And they wanted the South to rule like a conquered province, right? And so when you look at radical Reconstruction, you can see that the state of Texas, if you look at Texas and Louisiana are one conquered province. And if you look here, you got one, two, three, four, five military districts. Tennessee was the only state that was able to rejoin the Union before radical Reconstruction. So under the leadership of Philip Sheridan, we're actually a conquered province. And so, under this plan, only Congress has the authority to admit states. That's radical Republicans. Only 10 states were divided. The 10 states were divided into five military districts. They were each occupied by the U.S. Army. 20,000 blue Union clad soldiers in the South. And we already said Tennessee was already part of the Union at this time. The citizens of each state must ratify the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment that guaranteed voting rights, and that former Confederates were refused the right to vote and to hold office. And it was basically, this was aimed to punish the white Southern conservative Democrats, and it really kept 12 Southern congressmen from being elected, which kept the power of the Democrats kind of minimal. All right. In addition to radical Reconstruction, you also have the possibility of impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So here's the 14th and 15th Amendment kind of laid out for you. Like I said, you can pause and take a look. And guys, make sure you take a look at the images that are in these PowerPoints, because you'll see these again through SAQs or on DBQs. So for the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, just to kind of talk about, we want the Democrat out of office, right? So we want to put somebody in there that's going to be for harsh treatment of the South to bring them back, and for slavery rights, correct? And so Congress passes this thing called the 10-Year of Office Act. And the 10-Year of Office Act is going to prohibit the president from removing any government official he appointed without Senate approval. Now, remember, Johnson was never elected. He took over as a result of Abraham Lincoln being assassinated. Before Lincoln was assassinated, he hires Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, to the cabinet. However, Andrew Johnson wanted him removed, and so the House Representative decides to impeach Johnson because of the removal, because of the violation of the Tenure of Office Act. However, he's going to be found innocent by one vote. So if you look here on the PowerPoint, you can see the article is voted 35 to 19. You needed two thirds vote to impeach the president, and he would have needed 36 votes. And at the last minute, this guy Edmund G. Ross was the deciding vote, and he decides to vote in favor of Andrew Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was never impeached, and it won't be until Bill Clinton gets impeached for lying to the public about Monica Lewinsky. Nixon would have been impeached, but he resigns before he comes up. He comes up on for impeachment. So obviously, Congress takes the dominant role at this time of the government um, by trying to impeach him, which doesn't work. And now I've got a loading page here, so hopefully this will load here in a sec. If not, let's escape out of this, and we'll go to. So there's the impeachment, and then. I got this loading page here. Well, I'm not worried about it. All right. So, talking about northern influence in the north. So let's talk about scalawags and carpetbaggers. So they're going to need help in order to enforce Reconstruction in the South. And so what you have is you have a group of scalawags who are people that already live in the South. They are Southern Republicans who foster the American system type programs. They're going to cooperate with the Northern politics and economy. And then you got carpetbaggers. And these carpetbaggers, what they are is they're from the North and they literally pack up all their belongings in a bag of carpet. So usually when you have the image of somebody running away from home, they have this bag attached to a stick. Well, that's because these carpetbaggers put all their possessions in a carpet bag, and they came to the South and they wanted to provide aid and help slaves with dealing with Reconstruction. So they're going to help. Let me see if there's anything else that I need you to know for that. Um, because the continual uh, installation of these Confederate leaders back into their congressional houses, there's going to be a lot of Southern resistance, and so there's a lot of different things that are going to form. Things like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League. These were secret terrorist societies that were formed to prevent blacks, scalawags, carpetbaggers from using their new power. So the Ku Klux Klan, which was formed in Tennessee by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest, which were a group of Southern white Protestants that are going to that were Confederates. They were insecure, anxious, and threatened by their loss of power and superiority. They're going to wear these white medieval robes with a Trinity cap and a hood on the face to ensure secrecy until 1877. Um, the white sheets also said to represent kind of the ghosts of the Confederacy, and so their goal was to inflict havoc, to inflict intimidation. They use a original insignia, which was a white purity Celtic cross outlined with red which represented violence on a black circle, which represented the world. Their four principles were chivalry, humanity, mercy, and patriotism. And you're going to see the Klan throughout our history going into the 1920s, 1950s, and even into the 1980s. Uh, in 1871, we're going to pass the Ku Klux Klan Act, which allows the Justice Department to bring terrorists who commit state crimes into federal court for trial. And so, basically, what the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, what this is your first form of domestic terrorism, led by the Ku Klux Klan, which was the best known one. And so, you see the evolution of the northern attitudes of blacks towards Reconstruction, um, how to define. Um, how to define the blacks' role in society, uh, granting them the right to vote, and how is that going to evolve in a government where the South is resistant towards doing that. So what happens as a result of white supremacy? So what you have is you have most blacks weren't allowed to vote because they had to jump through hoops like the literacy test, the poll taxes, the grandfather clause. The Republican influence is going to decline as liberal Republicans are going to start gaining power. The Amnesty Act of 1872 is going to restore political rights for most ex Confederates. More young Southerners are going to reach voting age each year. More Northerners came to believe that the natural rulers of the South were upper class whites. And then in 1877, Rutherford, Rutherford B. Hayes is going to withdraw troops, abandon the free blacks, scalawags, and carpetbaggers, and thereby they're going to nullify the 14th and 15th Amendment. That goes back to your state rights. All right. Remember, women who thought that they were going to, if African Americans were going to get the right to vote, then women should as well. They are not going to be included in the 15th Amendment. And so you're going to see further organizations like the American Equal Rights Association, the National Women's Suffrage Association, which you still see Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are still working towards women's suffrage. And then the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell. But you can kind of read how women were treated during this time period. They were just kind of the group that was kind of left out, unfortunately. And it won't be until 1920, when the 19th Amendment is passed, that women will get the right to vote. All right, so in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant will be elected president. He's going to use what we call waving the bloody flag, waving the bloody shirt, insignia of the Civil War, to win the election. And during Grant's presidency, a lot of scandals are going to occur while he was president. He was a Civil War hero, but he had no political experience, and he linked kind of the moderates with the radicals. And so, just to kind of talk about some of the scandals that happened while Grant was president. Um, if you were to rank Grant as far as effectiveness as president, he would be on the lower end of the spectrum. So, just some of the things that occurred while he was president. One was the Black Friday scandal, which happened in 1869. This is where two guys, James Fisk and Jay Gould, who were business owners, they were railroad and Wall Street speculators, tried to corner the gold market due to their belief that the government would pay back the credit extended during the Civil War in gold. Fisk and Gold bribed Grant's brother-in-law, who encouraged an appointment to the Treasury and who would alert Fisk and Gould when the government was selling gold so they could profit. Grant is going to uh, learn of the scheme and was able to sell enough gold to prevent a major financial disaster for the government. So that was called the Black Friday scandal in 1869. The Credit Mobilier scandal in 1872, which you see on the PowerPoint here. Major stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad formed a company, the Credit Mobilier of America, and gave its contracts to build the railroad. They sold or gave shares in this construction to influential congressmen. It was a lucrative deal for the congressmen because they helped themselves by approving federal subsidies for the cost of railroad construction without paying much attention to the expenses, enabling railroad builders to make huge profits. And so they create this dummy construction, and then they inflate the prices, and then they take the money for themselves. And then finally, in 1875, the whiskey ring scandal, where Grant's third secretary, Benjamin Bristow, who was Secretary of the Treasury, found a group of distillers that were falsifying reports. They treated the government out of millions of dollars in taxes. And when it was discovered that many of Grant's appointees were also involved in the scandal, included some of these appointees was Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock. So just all these scandals that went on during his presidency. Obviously, he's not remembered as a very good president. However, he did serve 8 years as president during the Reconstruction era. Like I said, he'll be reelected in 1872. All right. So, in the midst of Reconstruction, you have the South that's going to begin to rebuild themselves, right? And so they're going to become a little bit more diverse. They're going to learn. They're going to learn their lessons. The term New South refers to the attempt to replace the old Southern economy with the Northern economic system after the Civil War. There was an agricultural process in the South in the 1880s, but this section still lagged behind the rest of the U.S. New farm machinery was introduced during this time period. Agricultural colleges were established, among those Texas A&M. There was some diversification of crops: tobacco, rice, sugar, peanuts, beef, cattle, vegetables. So, for example, the American Tobacco Company is going to be set up in Durham, North Carolina. There was industrial progress in the South in the 1880s and 1890s. The Atlanta Constitution was a journal that was edited by Henry Grady, which preached laissez-faire capitalism to the South. The Booker T. Washington will become the first true black leader in America, and he'll set up an industrial school called the Tuskegee Institute in 1881. And in 1895, he'll write what we call the Atlanta Compromise speech, which he preaches patience, conservatism, and the need for blacks to enter skilled trades. He was a very conservative black leader. So, you think about leaders that were willing to earn their civil rights, and then there were some that were willing to fight for it right now. And so Booker T. Washington was more reserved. He believed in your education would get you respect, and your respect would get you equal rights. On the flip side of that, you've got a guy by the name of W.B. Du Bois who believed in rights now, and he'll establish the NAACP. For African Americans. So here are your first two political leaders for blacks, and so that's kind of the New South. Let's see here. All right, so for sharecropping, most Southerners are not going to be able to find work in the North, and so what happens is a lot of them will return to their owners for work, right? And so this is called sharecropping. So what happens is if you look at the process, basically what the former slave is provided land and seed, so they're given their own piece of land, and he promises to pay them back for the land and for any materials. And so as the sharecropper goes through the cycle, he's going to buy food, and he's going to have to live his life. He plants the crops, and then once the harvest happens, he has to pay back his owner. However, when he pays back his owner, he doesn't have enough money. And so, what happens to repay the debt? The sharecropper must promise the landowner a greater share of next year's crop, and it just goes in a big cycle. And so, if you really look at it, it's legalized slavery because even though the sharecropper is given the opportunity, he ends up in debt, and he just continually pays this debt over and over again, years and years upon end, harvest upon harvest. And so, tenant farming, sharecropping were two ways that Southerners are going to resist allowing economic freedom for African Americans. So this takes us to 1876 in the election between Samuel Tilden from a Democrat, and then Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the Republican nominee. And if you look here, you can see that they each had 50% of the vote, 185 to 184. And so, in order to become president, you had to have 51. So, who does it go to? It goes to the House of Representatives. And so, in the House of Representatives, they're going to decide on a compromise. So, in order for Hayes to become president, the Republican, he had to agree to remove federal troops from the South, to help develop the infrastructure in the South, and to appoint the Southerners to cabinet positions, and to limit the limited enforcement of radical equality. This will lead to kind of the redemption of the South. And so what happens is that basically what happens is after 12 years, they grow tired of Reconstruction. These abolitionists that we've talked about going all the way back to the 1840s are going to begin to die off. There's new industrialization of the North, led by Carnegie and Rockefeller, and there's really a moral exhaustion that happens in the North. And so, really, what happens is almost like the North kind of grows tired of Reconstruction. And so, what happens is they'll agree to allow Hayes to become president, and this will end Reconstruction. Um, there's this theory called kind of the lost cause ideology, that that um, the war was heroic. However, it got nothing done because if you're looking at what life was like in 1877, yes, you have these political advancements in the amendments in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but what you really don't have is you don't have further economic freedom, and these old Southern Confederates are still sitting in office in the South, and so we really kind of draw one kind of big old circle. All right. So if we were going to if we are going to talk about the successes and failures in Reconstruction, what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at this chart and kind of look at what happened, what was good, and what was bad about Reconstruction. What came from it. Some of the successes. We do pass the 14th and 15th Amendment. It ends imprisonment for debt. The New South begins constructing roads, public buildings. We have free public education for whites as well as blacks. We show that blacks can become more meaningful because in the process of all this, you do have a group of African Americans who do achieve a political office. For example, Blanche Bruce becomes a senator in Mississippi. Hiram Revels in Mississippi also becomes a senator, and this bridges the gap between these two guys, Bruce and Revels, going all the way to Barack Obama, who becomes senator of Illinois and later president of the United States. All in all, we eliminate slavery, right? So the word slavery can be taken out of discussion going forward. However, there are a lot of failures. We're disappointed with the carpetbag movement. It doesn't really gain a whole lot of steam. Economically, most Southern blacks remain in the South. They return to that form of bondage, and these governments are going to redeem it. So they're kind of called redeemer governments. And then, so these Redeemer governments are going to be elected across the South. They're characterized as being white only, opposed to racial equality, and made up of many former Confederate supporters. They replaced the Republican state governments they set up under the Congressional Reconstruction. These Redeemer state governments essentially meant that Reconstruction was over and that state and ex slaves could not count on federal government for protection. Um, that might be the last slide. So hopefully this will kind of give you an idea of, or hopefully bridges the gap, just to kind of talk about some of the effects of as a result of Reconstruction. The South now solid is the South now votes solidly for the Democratic Party due to bitterness over the radical Republican Reconstruction. The solid South means it's a political term which remained true until 1980. It won't be until Ronald Reagan wins the South as a Republican when that'll end. There is widespread corruption and graft in the government industry throughout the nation. The New South, or economy in the South, was characterized by tenant farming, sharecropping, and then later diversification of agriculture and the rise of industry. And then finally, the racial tension was heightened as discrimination used to get around legislation intended to bring racial equality. So, in talking about segregation, in 1896, a political court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, um, it becomes part is passed, which is basically legalized segregation. It won't be overturned until 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education. So it was led by conservative Democrats in the South. So the goal, political segregation, was to keep blacks from voting and holding political office. How do you do that? Well, one's through a poll tax, where one's got to pay $1 to $2 each time a person votes. Obviously, the poor are not going to be able to vote because they don't have enough money, and so they can't vote. However, this is made illegal in 1964 by the 24th Amendment. The problem is that some blacks could afford it and some poor whites couldn't, so they passed the literacy test. One had to pass a reading and writing test on the U.S. Constitution in order to register for a vote. Now, guys, this isn't going to be the easiest and easy test, right? If they're having to pass the test, they're going to make these tests as hard as possible to do that. Problem is that some blacks were smart and some whites were not, so they passed a grandfather clause, which gave the right to vote to those who registered as of March 1st, 1867, or their son or grandson. Um, so by 1915, blacks customarily weren't voting anyway. So that was one way to prevent political segregation. Economic segregation, which wanted to keep blacks as poor farmer servants and propertyless. We talked about like things like the sharecroppers. They could, tax assessors could raise their property taxes. Labor unions could exclude blacks from membership, and then of course the sharecropping thing. And this had a harmful effect on the Southern economy, as it put emphasis on cotton, and there was not a rotation or diversification, so depletion of the land resulted. And then social segregation, which is Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal public facilities. And this is where your Jim Crow laws come into effect. Jim Crow laws were segregation laws that passed by the states. The fear was instilled by blacks by the spread of lynchings, and so there was an average of 187 lynchings per year if they were found in public facilities. And so those are ways that segregation occurred, which I would say is one of the reasons why Reconstruction failed. All right, so make sure you read through chapter 15 and pull up any things I might have left out. Remember, this doesn't cover everything, but this should give you a little overview of what Reconstruction should look like. All right, if you have any questions, come see me. Thanks.